Well, with all those different aircraft in the airline, it sure would be nice to know what they're doing at any one time, and this screen also shows that information. In the center of the screen, we get that status, where currently we have the list filtered to the Boeing 757s, and we have the first one in the list selected. Notice at the left is the individual registration number of this aircraft. It is a Boeing 757, and currently it's idle at JFK Airport. If we select that aircraft, though, we can see down at the bottom of the screen what it's going to be doing for the rest of the day. In this case, again, it starts its day at JFK, where the yellow is loading passengers, blue is actually in transit for a flight, and green is unloading passengers. So after loading its passengers at JFK, it will be Flight 463 from JFK to Dallas, where it will unload the passengers, and then after a brief pause, load passengers for the next flight. In this case, Flight 128 from Dallas to O'Hare. When it arrives at O'Hare, the cycle repeats. It unloads passengers and then loads them again to return as Flight 129 back to Dallas-Fort Worth. Then the last flight of the day will be Flight 484 from Dallas to LAX. But notice that after it arrives at LA, there is a pause for about 4 hours where it doesn't do anything. Where at 8 o'clock Greenwich Mean Time, which is midnight in LA, it then loads passengers for what we know as a red-eye flight, in this case Flight 683 to Dallas-Fort Worth, where it will begin the next day at Dallas. As we mentioned before, the AI for the game is smart enough to assign appropriate types of aircraft to the appropriate routes. In this case, the 757s were the largest type of aircraft that lorry lines had at their disposal, and so it used them on the route from Dallas to New York. On the other hand, for smaller cities such as Norfolk, Virginia, it decided to use the medium-sized aircraft of the Airbus 320s and is also flying fewer flights on that route than it did to New York. In the case of serving Omaha, it used the smallest aircraft, the regional jets, and also flew 3 flights a day to Omaha. To Oklahoma City, which is about the same size as Omaha, it actually used a mixture of flights, in this case a slightly larger 737 on one of the flights and then 2 regional jets later in the day. This airline used a different approach when serving New York to the Bay Area. In this case, instead of 3, 4, 5 flights a day, it's actually running 8 flights a day, and you notice that their departure times are spread throughout the course of the day from 9:30 in the morning to about 9:30 in the evening. As we saw earlier in the timeline view, the artificial intelligence of the game is smart enough to know that it needs to follow some realistic procedures when scheduling flights. In this case, if we look at Flight 112 from Dallas to Chicago, we see that it arrives at 11:46 in the morning. However, when the computer scheduled Flight 113 to return from Chicago back to Dallas, you'll notice that it didn't have it depart until 1:20 in the afternoon, which gives a Boeing 757 enough time to unload all of its 200 passengers, service the aircraft, load the aircraft again. So that takes about an hour and a half to accommodate that. It also knows that if flights arrive too late in the evening, in this case flights that arrived at 9 o'clock and about 11:30, that it's not necessarily going to send them back at the same time. They would arrive too late at night. And so it rescheduled those aircraft for 7 o'clock and 9:30 in the morning. So those 2 aircraft would stay overnight in Chicago to be the first flights out in the morning. This even takes into account such things as transcontinental flights and the time distance. You'll notice that on a flight from Oakland to Newark, the last flight out for quite some time leaves at 2:43 in the afternoon and arrives over in New York at almost 11 o'clock at night. So therefore, instead of having flights that continue to leave in the afternoon and evening from Oakland, it decided to wait and have them leave at about 9 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and 1:15 to be red-eye flights that instead of arriving at 2 or 3 in the morning, arrive at 5, 7:10, and 9:16 in this example. Another thing to notice while we're on this screen is that the westbound flights from New York to the Bay Area on this regional jet took a little over 6 hours. On the other hand, the return flights from the west coast to the east coast only took 5 hours, and this is due to prevailing westerlies, the jet stream, etc. Certainly with all these airlines scheduling all these flights, they're bound to show up on our map at some point. If we notice at the bottom of the screen, it's approximately 6 o'clock in the morning Eastern and only 3 o'clock in the morning Pacific. But notice that we already have flights starting to appear on the map on the East Coast. As we advance to about 8:30 Eastern, which is of course 6:30 Mountain, notice that we now have more flights extending over more of the country. If we were to zoom in on the center portion of the map, we'd get a little more detail about what's going on with these flights. You notice that each flight now has a tag over it that includes the airline code and flight number, the type of aircraft, and the code for the origin and destination. Starting in the bottom left corner of the map, we can see some of the details about these flights. For example, Old School Flight 313 is a Canadair regional jet going from Dallas Love to St. Louis. Lorry Lines Flight 541, an Airbus 320 from Columbus to Dallas-Fort Worth. Prop Job Airlines 277 flying another regional jet from New Orleans to Cincinnati-Covington, and on and on. Raleigh-Durham to Dallas-Fort Worth, Detroit to Charlotte, Midway to Washington, D.C. Dulles, etc. And if we were to actually select by clicking on one of these aircraft, in this case Eagle Eye Flight 733, it's a Beechcraft 1900 from Kansas City to O'Hare, we'd see its information appear over at the right side of the screen, including now we see the scheduled departure and arrival times, the actual departure, and the estimated arrival time. In this case, it looks like it's going to arrive about 12 minutes ahead of schedule. We also see the number of passengers on board, which at this point is only 9, and when you realize that a Beechcraft 1900 only holds 19 passengers, it's about half full. So that we don't have to look at all of the aircraft from all of the airlines, we can filter down to just show one at a time. In this case, we're looking at Massive Lines, which, if you recall from earlier in the presentation, was the airline that was based in Atlanta and pretty much served everywhere in the country. Even then, there are a lot of flights in the area, and it gets a little cluttered to try to see. If we were to turn their tags off, you get a better picture of exactly how many flights are in the area for Massive Lines. Notice that still the airspace around Atlanta is rather crowded.